So, a couple of days ago, Netflix uploaded a trailer for a new ongoing show called Dear White People. Now, I kind of feel like a hipster asshole because I noticed and watched the documentary Dear White People quite a long time ago, and as such, this didn't affect me too much. Additionally, I have enjoyed several other, quote, liberal cash grab shows, like Transparent and Orange is the New Black. So, I don't think that despite an obvious political motivation, a show cannot still be entertaining if it is motivated by politics. As such, my first point here is don't necessarily judge a book by its cover. While I have no interest in watching this show, I also think that most pieces of media have at least the potential to be entertaining. If Dear White People is not at least amusing, then as far as I'm concerned, it's a failure. But we're quite a bit removed from being able to make that kind of assessment. So, what I really wanted to talk about today is how media affects the human mind, because I have seen several people decrying the very existence of this show as giving way to indoctrination or persuasion, and as such, as someone who knows a whole bungle about both persuasion and media psychology, let me explain why I'm not really worried about Dear White People. First, let me start by addressing this. Watching violent media or playing violent video games does not make you violent. Something like 5,000 studies on this, and many of which use horrific instrumentation because ethically you cannot measure violence, cannot find a causal link between media use and violence. By the way, for example, many of these studies, they instrumentalize aggression through shit like playing a loud noise in someone's ear. Yeah, that's how they measure aggression. To put some perspective into you. Anyway, there is a definitive correlation between violent media consumption and temporary aggression. Again, though, that is a short-term effect because your blood is pumping. It's something called excitation transfer. Basically, the film or game gets you all riled up, and your energy and emotions are filling you up, and then they are transferred into other sources. But again, this is a temporary reaction, not a change in permanent behavior. Playing a violent game or watching a violent movie simply does not make you violent. It may get your adrenaline flowing, and may make you more likely to rage quit and punch your keyboard, but it doesn't turn you into another person. It really just makes you a little bit more agitated. Now, there are three major theories in media psychology research that generally assess how we are affected by the media. The first and oldest is agenda setting theory, which posits that the media determines what we think about and not what we think about those subjects. The Coombs and Shaw 1972 initial data had an incredible 0.95 correlation between media and public thought, a correlation basically never seen in social science research. I mean, let me be very clear here. That is an insane R value that most social scientists would kill for. For example, when every news outlet is covering something like the election of Trump, the people are going to have Trump on the brain. However, their opinions aren't swayed merely by interacting with that media source. Basically, from the get-go of media research, we were seeing that a media doesn't affect how you think, but merely what you think about. And with countless smaller news sources and independent news media, even the agenda-setting function is now being criticized as no longer even extant. Computing Forever, Dave Cullen, made the argument the other day that Twitter restricting pro-Trump tweets was a new part of a new agenda-setting function.
We've heard, of course, of the agenda-setting function of the mass media. Well, this appears to be the agenda-setting function of social media. This is nothing new. As I mentioned before, Facebook has been censoring conservative news stories from its feed for some time now, but it's also done some other rather sinister things.
And I'm not sure if I believe in that or if I buy that from a data-based standpoint. I think that it may be a new form of a filter bubble, but I am unsure of the true definition of this difference. The next theory is priming, which essentially is the use of language, imagery, and sounds and other media to form or associate mental meanings of media messages through cognitive associations. The way that priming can affect how we think, and not just what we think about when we use media, a la agenda setting, is through the use of cognitive heuristics, which are like little roads in our brains that connect certain ideas. For example, I'm going to read your mind right now. Get ready. Yellow. Now think of a food. Got it? Now watch as I work my magic and read your mind. Was the food you thought of a banana? Or maybe a lemon? Yeah, right? See, I was correct. That's how a cognitive heuristic works. I activate the association of a color with food, and then there's just a guess beyond that. Obviously, our brains are inexorably complex, and not everyone will have the same thought of lemon or banana because our mental roadmaps are all different, or perhaps because my prime just wasn't salient enough. Anyway, the thing about priming is it has a short-term effect. If at the end of this video I ask you to think of a food again, the first thing you will probably think of is not going to be a banana anymore. The ability for priming to have any effect on long-term processing is relegated to repeated exposure. Essentially, what can happen is if the same prime is activated over and over and over, that little mental pathway becomes worn down and the association is activated more and more quickly. One way this can work in media is attributable to another theory called the mere exposure effect, which simply states that the more we're exposed to something or someone, the more we tend to like it. So just seeing a TV character a lot can cause you to form what's called a parasocial relationship, and we're getting there with that character just from having seen them. Finally, this is the last major theory. There's framing, which is a specific tactic used by content creators to attempt to make the audience feel or think a certain way and ultimately to change their opinions. Framing, unlike agenda setting and priming, informs the audience on how to think or feel about a specific issue or topic by making certain aspects of that issue more or less salient. Framing is a process of message development that strategically presents a topic by increasing or decreasing the salience of components of that topic. This can be performed by making the topic seem more positive or negative, or by emphasizing certain elements.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
The process of framing allows message producers to develop messages strategically designed to persuade audiences' opinions by affecting information salience. That doesn't mean it always works, but for example with this Dear White People thing, yes, the creators are clearly framing an anti-white message with their series, but judging from the backlash, that just goes to show how very temperamental of a concept framing is, and how it can very frequently fail. So, while there is a wealth of research trying to link exposure to violent media and yet a dearth of causal data, why would anyone be concerned about films and TV shows that feature minorities and LGBTQ people? I mean, as I've shown you, the data indicate that most people with a shred of rationality stopped buying the video game's cause of violence narratives back even before Anita Sarkeesian decided that video games were the scourge of the earth, creating mass armies of angry keyboard warriors to harass her to the point where she had to go and frickin' cry to the UN about it. Anyway, generally people have started to catch on to the idea that the media doesn't affect us, at least not directly. So why all the concern with these PC shows like Orange is the New Black and Transparent, and now with this Dear White People thing? I think it's because people don't want these narratives to become popularized. And I want to go a little bit more in depth into psychology about how that happens and explain why it's not so bad in further detail. First, we need to go all the way back to 1954. Allport releases the groundbreaking work The Nature of Prejudice, developing something called the contact hypothesis. See, during the Second World War, the US Army started to desegregate and merge black and white units. At the time, many military officials anticipated disaster, and troops on both sides protested the integration. But do you know what happened? It worked out. It worked out really well, actually. And contrary to all expectations, these soldiers often became close friends, sometimes forming lifelong bonds based on their shared camaraderie as brothers in arms. That's the contact hypothesis. We tend to form positive opinions towards groups we were previously unexposed to once we were exposed to them in person, particularly if the exposure is positive. Like the mere exposure effect, sometimes just being around a group we previously had a negative opinion about makes us less prejudiced. Skip ahead a few decades to Schiappa, Gregg, and Hughes, developing the mediated analog of this effect, the parasocial contact hypothesis, and they found the same sort of thing when they took a bunch of people who didn't personally know any gays and showed them a positive media portrayal of a gay man. Their attitudes towards gays increased. Now, hold your horses. That doesn't mean that media is somehow digging into your skull and fooling you with propaganda. My biggest issue is not having positive portrayals of minorities or LGBTQ or whatever. Like I said with framing, if your message is too repugnant, all this other psychological shit won't matter a lick. I take no umbrage with the preponderance of media that is now pro-gay, pro-LGBTQ, or pro-minority, or pro-whatever. All it does is slightly increase the possibility that racial tensions will decrease because everyone is seeing these positive and negative views of race, right? No, that's not right, because we're starting to see a shift towards this white people are evil narrative. Fuck white people is now an okay thing to say. It's now alright to joke about white genocide. It's now okay to make a series called Dear White People where you mock whites. So, I talked all happy about all those pro-social effects of mere exposure and parasocial contact hypothesis? Yeah. Remember back a little bit before that when I talked about overexposure to repeated primes causing those little mental pathways to turn into mental highways? Yeah, that's where I'm concerned, because that, in society through repetition, is how racist schema form. Frankly, there is not much research on this, in my opinion, and I'm sure in the opinion of any IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board, to conduct such research in the simulation of racist schema, because it is highly unethical. So there's my concern. Any individual is nothing, and you shouldn't cancel your Netflix subscription to miss out on the next season of Daredevil over it. Please do not. However, the growing frequency of this is disconcerting to me. We're always talking about white people. That's agenda setting. We're always talking about how white people are bad. That's repetitive priming. We're always sending a message about how white people are evil and bad and awful and terrible. That's framing. That is the triad of media psychology, which is up against a hopeful outcome here. I am something of an aberrant when it comes to media psychology, because I am one of very few people who considers themselves a media positivist. And by that I mean I am generally positive about the ways that media can be used. So frankly, yes, I am less educated on the dark side research. That is the racist, sexist, hateful research that most are so intrigued by. As such, I tend to look at media based on the data we have on the parasocial contact hypothesis, for example, and how it has been shown to quantitatively help race relations and reduce racial biases. But I do understand how media can have distinct negative outcomes. I must stress that those negative outcomes usually have less hard research behind them than the positive pieces of research. I mean, sorry. Ultimately, my point about this show is that it doesn't matter unless this becomes the norm. As such, we should be concerned about a change in the direction of media to create anti-white programming. However, one show alone does very little. We need to understand how the media affects the public at large, and also understand how those effects are typically limited and minute. Despite the typical minutia of events, we simultaneously need to be aware of the potential for media to persuade or affect public opinion, as I have demonstrated in this video. While one series may be harmless and inconsequential, if such a thing were to become the norm, we could potentially have a huge problem of race relations on our hands. As an end note, I leave you with these thoughts. First, do not end your Netflix subscription over one show. Trust me, there is tons of garbage on Netflix already not worth your time. Second, be aware of a change in media to reflect anti-white propaganda, and on your own, raise awareness when you see it. Third, never judge a book by its cover. A series that looks like SJW trash could actually end up looking decent. I mean, yeah, it's rare, yeah, it's unlikely, but yeah, it is a possibility. Those are my main suggestions, as wrong as they may be. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.